In the shadows of the 1990s, certain confessions cut deep. A guitarist wrote in his 2007 memoir that drugs were only replaced when he found God. In Seattle, a 1994 interview captured a young singer admitting he was born again. And from there, fans whispered that the band had broken apart on its own. And on MTV, a frontman simply disappeared from television, only to be seen years later in a small church in Tennessee. Some called it salvation. Others said it was a betrayal of the rebellious spirit. But whether fact or rumor, faith had clearly become a turning point for several grunge legends. So when Brian "Head" Welch left Korn, when Jeremy Enigk confessed his beliefs, or when John Davis abandoned MTV in search of peace, what truly lay behind those choices? Stay with me as we trace each story. Brian "Head" Welch. From heavy metal to the light of faith. He was a guitarist who once shook entire stadiums, his riffs crashing like a storm. But at the very height of success, he walked away, sold his possessions, and turned up in a setting no one expected, sitting in a church, speaking about God. That man was Brian "Head" Welch. Welch was born in 1970 in Bakersfield, California. With a group of friends, he founded Korn in 1993. Within only a few years, Korn had created a new sound. Dark, heavy, mixing rap and metal. Their 1998 album, Follow the Leader, hit #1 on the Billboard charts, sold millions of copies, and launched the nu metal wave. MTV played their videos endlessly. With Issues in 1999 and Untouchables in 2002, Korn became a giant, headlining nearly every major rock festival. With his long dreadlocks, 7-string guitar, and aggressive playing style, Welch left an unforgettable image in the minds of fans. But the stage lights could not rescue him from his private darkness. Addicted to methamphetamine and alcohol, Welch admitted that he often sank into despair. He had a young daughter, yet he was rarely present in her life. In his memoir, Save Me From Myself, published in 2007, Welch wrote that the moment he watched his daughter sleeping was the moment he realized if he didn't change, he would lose everything. And that change came from a place few expected: faith. In 2005, Welch announced he was leaving Korn. The press covered it nonstop, and fans were stunned. Some headlines even called it the biggest shock in American metal. People debated endlessly. How could a rocker known for rebellion suddenly turn toward spirituality? Korn's loyal followers were divided. Some admired his courage, while others felt betrayed. A few even claimed that Korn had lost the danger that once defined them. Welch ignored the noise. He sold off assets, broke old habits, and devoted time to raising his daughter. He became part of a church community, played worship, music, and shared his testimony with believers. The new image stood in stark contrast to memories of a drug-ravaged rocker stumbling backstage. It inspired some, while leaving others in disbelief. Over time, this decision opened a new path. When Welch eventually returned to Korn years later, he was no longer the man consumed by drugs, but a sober father, balancing fierce music with inner peace. His story became proof that even in the extreme world of metal, there was room for redemption, for a man to find himself again. That is why Brian "Head" Welch is often remembered as a rare symbol, a metal guitarist who found the light of faith when everything else seemed lost. And if his choice shook the global metal community, then in 1999 Seattle, a young frontman caused similar surprise when he made his own confession of belief. That man was Jeremy Enigk. Jeremy Enigk, The confession that shook Seattle. Seattle, mid-1990s. A young band had just released their debut album, and their sound felt like a fresh breeze after the Nirvana era. In the eyes of the press, they were the new flag that Sub Pop could rally around. But not long after, just as the spotlight was finding them, the lead singer made a confession that left the underground scene stunned. A single statement that, more than 20 years later, fans still argue about. That man was Jeremy Enigk. Born in 1974 in Seattle, Enigk joined Sunny Day Real Estate in 1992. He was still very young, yet his voice quickly became the band's center. With Diary in 1994, they were instantly seen as the new voice after Nirvana, an album both fierce and introspective. Songs like Seven and In Circles became instant touchstones, putting Enigk and his bandmates on magazine covers. LP2 followed in 1995, a bit more chaotic, but still proof of their creativity. With Seattle waiting for a next generation, many thought Sunny Day Real Estate was the answer. And then came the confession of faith. Enigk told the press that he was born again, that he had found God. For young grunge fans who saw rock as the very symbol of resistance to authority, especially religion, it felt like a slap. Rumors spread quickly. The band broke up because of Enigk. This is the premature death of emo grunge. Other members denied it, saying there were many other conflicts, but the image of Enigk tied to faith became permanent. His solo album, Return of the Frog Queen in 1996, made it clear. Gone were the heavy guitars, replaced by strings, piano, and something that felt almost like a hymn. Some fans felt alienated, but others realized Enigk hadn't left music. He had simply changed the way he sang about life. His voice remained fragile and haunting, but now it reached for peace. When Sunny Day Real Estate reunited later, Enigk was still part of it. The band no longer carried the same momentum, but his presence was a reminder. Here was an artist who dared to openly change his faith, even when it shocked his community. To those watching from a distance, his story carried another irony. While many of his peers were lost to drugs and loneliness, Enigk chose a different path and survived. Looking back, older fans often ask, did Enigk's faith save him from the spiral of addiction that consumed Seattle? Or was it simply another reason for a band already divided? No one can say for sure. But one thing is certain, the image of that young man, standing at a microphone and declaring that he had found God, still echoes as one of the most unbelievable moments in grunge history. And if Seattle's shock came from a young band at its beginning, then in Tennessee, another story played out. A frontman once seen daily on MTV, his songs blaring in college dorms at the end of the 90s, suddenly vanished from the charts. Years later, he was found not on a stage, but in a small church, playing worship music. That man was John Davis of Superdrag. John Davis. From MTV to the church. There was a frontman who once seemed everywhere on MTV, his song blasting through college dorms in the late 1990s. Then suddenly, his name vanished from the rock scene. While many wondered where he had gone, others spotted him in a small Tennessee church, playing worship music instead of rock anthems. That man was John Davis, the voice of Superdrag. Born in 1974 in Knoxville, Tennessee, Davis and his friends formed Superdrag in the early 90s. Their debut album, Regretfully Yours in 1996, put them in the spotlight. The single Sucked Out was a constant presence on MTV, climbing the Billboard Modern Rock charts and turning Superdrag into one of the most talked-about bands. Davis, with his guitar and long hair falling forward, became a familiar image for a generation of fans. But behind the glow was a harsher truth. Record label pressures, endless touring, and the pull of alcohol and drugs were breaking him down. In later interviews, Davis admitted that during those dark years, he hit a turning point. He found faith, saying that becoming born again had saved his life, helped him leave addiction behind, and forced him to reevaluate everything. When Superdrag broke up in 2003, Davis didn't cling to the stage. Instead, he turned fully to music of faith. His solo album John Davis in 2005 made the shift clear. The music was still powerful, but the lyrics were entirely different. Not the biting commentary of Sucked Out, but a search for forgiveness and peace. Fans responded in different ways. Some felt regret, saying Davis had walked away from opportunity, while alt-rock still had room to grow. Others acknowledged that his choice may have saved him from the tragic fate of so many rockers. Looking back at Seattle contemporaries, Layne Staley, Kurt Cobain, it became easier to see why. Davis wanted a different life. In church gatherings, Davis was no longer an MTV star, but just a man with a guitar, singing what he believed. That simplicity stood in sharp contrast to his past, and for that very reason, his story stuck with people. When Superdrag reunited a few times later, fans welcomed him back, but no one doubted that Davis had already found another home. For many who listen today, Davis's story is proof of something simple. Not everyone needs to cling to fame to survive. Sometimes, stepping away from the stage is the only way to live longer. And from a voice that left MTV to find peace in church, we turn back to another Seattle legend. A man known publicly as a symbol of darkness and defiance, but who, in his private life, remained deeply tied to the Orthodox Church. That man was Chris Cornell. Chris Cornell, the voice of Seattle and the shadow of the church. The first thing people remembered about him wasn't rebellion, but a voice soaring and sorrowful at the same time, strong enough to quiet an entire stadium. Yet behind that unforgettable sound stood a scene few imagined: the solemn rituals of the Orthodox Church, where he and his family often sought peace. Only later would fans piece together those two seemingly opposite images into a single portrait: Chris Cornell. Born in 1964 in Seattle, Cornell's early life was marked by upheaval, anxiety, and loneliness. In the early 1980s, he helped form Soundgarden, one of grunge's first pioneers. With Badmotorfinger in 1991, and especially Super Unknown in 1994, the band broke into the global stage. Songs like Black Hole Sun and Spoonman cemented him as one of the era's defining voices. Later, he joined forces with members of Rage Against the Machine to create Audioslave, delivering new hits like a Stone. What surprised many was that, even while fronting music born of defiance, Cornell had personal ties to the Greek Orthodox Church through his family life and marriage. Far from the image of a destructive rocker, he sometimes appeared quietly at church services, something rarely mentioned in mainstream coverage. For many fans, it felt like a contradiction. His lyrics often challenged religion, yet in private, he maintained a quiet connection to tradition. Throughout his career, Cornell never hid his battles with depression and addiction. He spoke openly about the darkness in his mind, about how music was often the only way to confront it. Perhaps for that reason, the church became a quiet anchor for him, a place of stillness against the backdrop of roaring crowds. When Cornell died in 2017, many articles pointed out this paradox. An artist who often sang of emptiness, yet who had chosen a spiritual home for his family. For older fans, that detail made his story even more layered. He wasn't only the rebellious rock icon, he was also a man who searched for peace in the midst of chaos. And if Chris Cornell kept a silent thread tied to the church, the next figure carried the opposite story. A singer consumed by addiction, who often used his lyrics to rail against what he saw as religious hypocrisy. That man was Layne Staley of Alice in Chains. Layne Staley, a voice that cried out against faith. There was a voice from Seattle that left a generation trembling, harsh, haunting, unforgettable. But in many of his songs, that same voice turned its rage toward religion, treating it as hollow and hypocritical. That tension made him magnetic and deeply unsettling. That man was Layne Staley of Alice in Chains. Born in 1967 in Kirkland, Washington, Staley joined Alice in Chains in the late 1980s. Their debut album, Facelift in 1990, introduced Man in the Box to MTV, while Dirt in 1992 secured their place as one of the four pillars of grunge. His raw, drawn-out powerful vocals became the band's hallmark. Staley never hesitated to aim his anger at organized religion. Songs like Godsmack or Junkhead were often read as direct challenges. Some fans took them as his personal statements, while others saw them simply as reflections of Seattle's rebellious energy at the time. Either way, questioning faith became part of his musical identity. Offstage, Staley faced his own private battles: heroin addiction, depression, and isolation. As his health declined, he disappeared almost entirely, living out his last years in near-total seclusion. When he died in 2002, many fans reflected on the cruel symmetry. A singer who often wrote about death and disbelief, finally consumed by the very despair he had described. If Jeremy Enigk or John Davis found escape in faith, Staley chose to fight against it, and that path led him to tragedy. A choice that set him apart and ensured that his name remains a point of debate to this day. And from a singer who resisted faith until he vanished into darkness, we turn to another story, one of Jason Everman, a man who left the stage behind to put on a uniform and who would later discover purpose through discipline and a spiritual calling. Jason Everman, from grunge guitar to military service. There is a name that once passed through both Nirvana and Soundgarden, yet most fans barely remember it. He appeared briefly on Seattle stages, then disappeared. Years later, people no longer saw him with a guitar, but in a military uniform, marching in distant war zones. That man was Jason Everman. Born in 1967 in Alaska, Everman grew up in Washington and quickly threw himself into music. In 1989, he joined Nirvana as a touring guitarist right after Bleach was released. He also played bass for a short time with Soundgarden. But unlike his bandmates, who later became legends, Everman did not stay. Internal disagreements, along with personality differences, led him to walk away from grunge just as it was exploding. After leaving music, Everman took a turn no one expected. He enlisted in the United States Army. He served in special forces, deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq. For grunge fans, it was almost impossible to imagine a guitarist who had once shared stages with Kurt Cobain and Chris Cornell, now carrying a rifle in uniform. In rare interviews later, Everman explained that military discipline and the bond of brotherhood gave him a sense of meaning that music no longer offered. Some of his fellow soldiers recalled that he kept a private spiritual life, finding balance in those harsh moments. No longer chasing the roar of a crowd, he found quiet strength in discipline and faith. For audiences today, Everman stands as a striking contrast. While many of his peers from Seattle fell to drugs and despair, he chose a life of discipline, belief, and survival. He became proof that not every story from Seattle ended in tragedy. And if Everman laid down his guitar to find purpose in service and faith, the next story is of a young female singer who walked away from a rising band for family and belief, only to return years later. That was Lacy Sturm of Flyleaf. Lacy Sturm, from rock stage to prayer. She was once a frontwoman who screamed across stages with such force that an entire generation of metal fans in the early 2000s saw her as an icon. But just as her career was burning brightly, she shocked fans by stepping away, choosing family and faith instead. That woman was Lacy Sturm of Flyleaf. Born in 1981 in Homestead, Florida, Lacy endured an unsettled childhood. When she co-founded Flyleaf, her voice quickly stood out, soft at times, searing at others. The band's self-titled debut in 2005 brought I'm So Sick to heavy rotation on MTV, while Memento Mori in 2009 climbed high on the Billboard charts. Sturm became one of the rare women to front a successful alternative metal band, standing shoulder to shoulder with male peers. In 2012, Sturm announced she was leaving Flyleaf. She explained she wanted to spend more time with her family and live fully within her faith. For fans, it was a shock. A singer at her peak, stepping away for peace. During this time, Sturm wrote books, appeared at faith-based events, and released solo music. Still rock, but with lyrics centered on redemption and hope. When she eventually returned to Flyleaf years later, her voice was the same, but her spirit had changed. Some fans saw it as the loss of a rebellious image. Others understood it as a sign of growth. If Lacy Sturm chose to leave the stage to protect her faith, the next story belongs to a frontman who never abandoned music, but who used his lyrics again and again to confront organized religion. That man was Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. Eddie Vedder, lyrics, that question, faith. From the very beginning with Pearl Jam, Eddie Vedder built a voice that was unmistakable, raspy, heavy, and full of sorrow. While many Seattle musicians of his era either leaned into religion or rebelled against it outright, Vedder stood in the middle. He used music itself as the space to question faith. Born in 1964 in Illinois, Vedder grew up in a Catholic household. But the conflicts of his childhood pushed him away from that foundation early on. When Pearl Jam released 10 in 1991, with songs like Alive, Jeremy, and Black, Vedder quickly became one of the defining voices of grunge, a singer who could sound wild and unrestrained, yet deeply reflective. In his lyrics, Vedder often addressed religion with a sharp edge. Do the Evolution criticized mankind's self-proclaimed dominion. Marker in the Sand highlighted hypocrisy and belief. But behind the critique, audiences still felt something spiritual. He sang about human connection, about nature, and about the search for meaning beyond ritual. Vedder never claimed to have abandoned faith entirely. He simply made clear that he could not accept organized religion's rigid control. For many fans, this made him a role model, a man who never stopped questioning, yet always carried a hunger for truth. For older listeners, Vedder represents a familiar paradox. Raised Catholic, but standing apart to sing about doubt. In a time when many artists lost their way, he grounded himself by turning those questions of faith into music. And from one singer who questioned belief rather than abandoning it, we moved to Jerry Cantrell, who filled his songs with religious imagery, yet openly admitted his own skepticism. Jerry Cantrell, religious symbols in music and a life of doubt. Even in the most famous songs by Alice in Chains, listeners can hear religious imagery, questions of heaven, redemption, and the presence of God. But when asked, the band's primary songwriter insisted he never fully embraced any religion, carrying skepticism instead. That was Jerry Cantrell. Born in 1966 in Tacoma, Washington, Cantrell grew up in a Catholic household. Church left him with a vocabulary rich in imagery, something he would later pour into his songwriting. Together with Layne Staley, Cantrell helped make Alice in Chains one of the big four of grunge. With Facelift in 1990, Dirt in 1992, and Jar of Flies in 1994, the band carved out a dark, heavy sound. Cantrell's guitar riffs, paired with his haunting harmonies, became inseparable from Seattle's legacy. Songs like Heaven Beside You, God Am, and Your Decision used religious symbols to explore guilt, pain, and loss. Yet in interviews, Cantrell repeatedly admitted he never truly believed in doctrine. For him, religion was more like a mirror. It could reveal truths, but just as easily distort them. Outside of music, Cantrell lived quietly, avoiding the chaos that consumed many of his peers. Even after Staley was gone, he carried Alice in Chains forward, keeping the band alive into the present. For many older fans, Cantrell embodies a quieter paradox, raised in Catholicism, but turning faith into artistic language rather than personal conviction. If Eddie Vedder questioned belief through words, Cantrell transformed it into imagery, skeptical, yet deeply expressive. And from his quiet doubt, we arrive at Jeff Ament, Vedder's bandmate in Pearl Jam, who carried his Catholic roots into a different kind of life, one defined not by ritual, but by simplicity and giving. Jeff Ament, from Catholic roots to a life of simplicity. Jeff Ament's childhood in Montana was shaped by Catholic church services and small-town ritual. Yet as he grew older, he chose a different path, holding on to the memories of faith, but living simply, avoiding ceremony, and focusing on music and community work. Born in 1963, Ament left Montana in search of art, eventually arriving in Seattle. There, he played with Green River and Mother Love Bone before co-founding Pearl Jam alongside Eddie Vedder. From 10 in 1991 to Vitalogy in 1994, Ament's steady bass lines anchored the band's sound, while his artistic sense helped shape many of their album covers. In later years, when asked about religion, Ament admitted he kept his distance. He no longer tied himself to organized Catholicism, yet faith lingered in the way he lived. Instead of ritual, he found meaning in action, building skate parks for young people, supporting Native communities in Montana, and working on independent art projects. For older fans, Ament's life reflects a gentle paradox. Raised within Catholic discipline, he chose instead a quiet, steady existence, allowing faith to show itself not through words, but through deeds. In him, there was no dramatic rebellion and no loud declaration, only a steady life lived with purpose. And in that sense, Jeff Ament closes this circle with a reminder. In the world of grunge, faith did not only appear in shocking confessions or rebellious lyrics. Sometimes it lived quietly in the way a person chose to live each day, simply and with kindness.